Have you ever noticed how society tries to convince you that at 40, life is going downhill, that it's too late to start over, change course, or discover who you really are? Quite the opposite is true. Carl Jung argued that around this age, the unconscious begins to knock loudly on the door, demanding that the persona, the mask we wear to please the world, be cast aside. Spirituality confirms this. It is at this point that the ego can no longer sustain external expectations on its own, and the self begins to reveal itself. And here's the controversial part. What many call the midlife crisis isn't a crisis, it's an awakening. The fatigue of masks, the feeling of emptiness, the nagging questions about purpose aren't signs of weakness, but of maturity. It's life calling you to truly live, not just survive. From this point on, you no longer need to prove yourself, no longer need to seek acceptance at any cost. What you need is the courage to rebuild yourself and the wisdom to hear the voice that has been muffled for decades. And the great reward? Upon crossing this portal, you discover that life truly begins only at 40. Because it's at this moment that the past transforms into wisdom, limitations fall away, and purpose is reborn with force. So the question is, will you continue to believe the lie of the crisis, or will you accept the invitation to the greatest new beginning of your life? Turning 40 isn't just about blowing out candles on a bigger cake. It's about staring into the mirror of the soul with a clarity previously absent. Carl Jung said that it's precisely at this stage that the unconscious begins to call more forcefully, demanding that we cast aside the illusions of youth and finally look within. Spirituality agrees. It's the moment when the ego, tired of so many masks, can no longer sustain the drama of life alone. The feeling is almost universal, as if, up until now, we've lived to fulfill roles, meet expectations, and accumulate achievements. But upon crossing that line, something changes. A restlessness arises, a silent call that asks, is this all there is? This awakening at 40 is no coincidence. Until this age, most people live driven by external desires, building a career, starting a family, achieving recognition. All of this is legitimate, but it's rarely enough. The persona, this social mask we wear to be accepted, works well in the early stages of life, but begins to crack at this stage. This is when the self, this greater center described by Jung, begins to manifest. It demands authenticity, integration, and finally asks us to look at the internal archetypes that have been silenced for years. And ignoring this call brings consequences: anxiety, existential crises, and a feeling of emptiness even amidst achievements. In practice, this awakening can manifest itself in curious ways. Some begin to question the job that seemed stable. I spent 20 years here, but was this what I wanted? Others realize that the relationships they maintained no longer reflect their inner truth. Some look at their own choices and feel as if they've lived for others. Spirituality calls this a rebirth. It doesn't matter if the person is financially or emotionally well off. If this calling appears, it doesn't disappear. It's as if life is saying, now is the time to live your story, not someone else's. And here's an essential detail. This awakening doesn't mean that turning 40 is too late. Quite the opposite. It's maturity that allows us to see what previously went unnoticed. Jung believed that only from this stage onwards does it become possible to truly delve into shadow work, because we already have the emotional strength to face our own shadow. Before, we often lacked the courage or patience for this. Now there's more clarity, more urgency, and more wisdom to look within. It's also at this point that identity crises arise. The ego, accustomed to being in charge, comes into conflict with the self, which demands space. It's common to hear statements like, "I don't know who I am anymore," or "it feels like I'm starting from scratch." This is the sign that individuation, a central process in Jungian psychology, is taking hold. It's frightening, but also liberating. Because for the first time, you realize that life isn't at an end, but the beginning of something much greater. And the most fascinating thing is that despite the intensity of this awakening, it's not a random collapse. It's a natural part of the human journey. The psyche seems to have its own clock, and at 40, the alarm of authenticity rings. From this point on, the quest is no longer to please the world, but to rediscover yourself. This phase doesn't require perfection, but the courage to admit that until now, you've lived a certain way, and that perhaps that way is no longer enough. And of course, this calling brings with it a peculiar exhaustion. The weariness of sustaining so many masks and external expectations. It's as if, upon awakening, we realize the weight of everything we are not, and that we've carried for decades. At 40, what's felt most isn't the age in the body, but the weight of accumulated masks. Carl Jung said that the persona is necessary. Without it, we can't live in society. But when it becomes the center of life, it imprisons. And by this point, many realize they've spent decades trying to be what was expected of them. The good professional, the ideal partner, the obedient son, the always available friend. Spirituality reminds us that each mask we wear steals a bit of our vital energy, and added together, they become an unbearable burden. That's when fatigue sets in, not physically, but spiritually. A fatigue of pretending, of responding, of maintaining a script that was never written by the heart itself. This exhaustion manifests itself in small signs. Meetings that were once bearable now feel like torture. Social gatherings that were once fun now feel forced. Even compliments, which once massaged the ego, lose their effect. It's the ego screaming for more recognition, but the self no longer content with crumbs. The shadow, in turn, begins to exact the price of everything that was denied, repressed emotions, ignored desires, swallowed truths. Shadow work becomes inevitable because it's no longer possible to sustain so many layers of illusion. A practical example. A woman who has always been seen as strong and in control reaches 40 and realizes she's exhausted from being everyone's support system. The archetype of the caregiver, once exalted, now needs to give way to the archetype of the wise woman who demands solitude and truth, or a man who has always been praised for being the funny one in the group, but who, deep down, yearns for silence and depth. This exhaustion is the invitation. Stop living for others and start discovering who you are without masks. This process is painful because it disrupts deeply held beliefs. From an early age, we learn that being loved depends on pleasing, that being respected requires responding, that being accepted means adapting, and we spent years believing this was life. But at 40, this formula breaks down. It's no longer possible to sustain external expectations without feeling the internal toll. Jung called this the collapse of the persona, the moment when the mask, worn so often, no longer fits. This is where many people experience the famous midlife crisis. But it's not a crisis of aging, it's a crisis of awakening. Spirituality sees it as a turning point, the soul refusing to remain disguised. This weariness, which seems like weakness, is actually strength. It's the energy that was once spent sustaining false roles, now asking to be used for something authentic. And when this realization arrives, something powerful happens. The need for self-discovery arises. It's no longer about asking, what does the world expect of me, but who am I really? It's at this point that the process of individuation begins, albeit belatedly. When this fatigue with masks sets in, a question arises that previously had no place. Who am I without all these roles? Carl Jung called this process individuation. the path toward the self, the totality of being. And at 40, this calling intensifies like never before. Spirituality reminds us that there is no wrong time to awaken. Many believe it's already too late, but it is precisely at this stage that we have the emotional maturity to face the shadows, understand the archetypes that inhabit us, and delve honestly into shadow work. This belated self-discovery can be more profound than any search undertaken in youth, because now there is greater awareness, more baggage, and fewer illusions. This individuation isn't theoretical. It manifests itself in everyday life. It's when a person realizes they can no longer tolerate superficial relationships, that they prefer a genuine conversation to 10 forced social encounters. It's when they begin to take an interest in spirituality, psychology, or philosophy, seeking answers that never came from the external world. Some begin to write, others seek analytical therapy, others turn to art or spiritual practices they previously considered nonsense. This movement is the soul asking for space to express itself. The ego resists, of course, but the self no longer accepts being ignored. A practical example, someone who has always lived to please realizes at 40 that they never ask themselves what they truly like. They discover that they prefer silence to parties, or that the career they've had for 2 decades has nothing to do with their essence. It may be painful to admit this, but it's also liberating. It's like waking up from a dream that's too long. And here, shadow work is key. Writing about repressed memories, facing denied feelings, recognizing traces of the shadow. Jung stated that only those who integrate the shadow can walk toward the self. Late self-discovery also brings a sense of humility. At 20, many believe they know everything. At 30, they still have plenty of time, but at 40 comes the clarity that life is finite and that every choice matters. This sense of urgency is a powerful driver of awakening. It's here that one begins to ask themselves, if I continue as I am, where will I go? And at this point, realizing that the old path no longer serves is the first step toward creating a new one. This process doesn't mean completely rejecting the past, but rather redefining it. Everything experienced so far can be transformed into learning material. Jung said that nothing in the psyche is lost. Everything can be integrated. Pain becomes wisdom, mistakes become experience, even masks can be worn consciously without confusion of identity. Spirituality reinforces, it's not about erasing what was, but about being reborn within what is. And when this self-discovery begins to happen, the next step is inevitable, freeing yourself from the old limitations that have imprisoned you for so long. Because it's not enough to simply know yourself. You must let go of what has prevented your truth from blossoming. Self-discovery opens a door, but the crossing only happens when we free ourselves from the chains that have kept us trapped. Carl Jung explained that the ego creates walls to protect us, but these same walls, over time, become prisons. At 40, consciousness begins to perceive these limits. Beliefs inherited from family, social patterns, cultural expectations, and even internal narratives repeated for years. Spirituality teaches that each of these limitations is like an invisible thread pulling us back, even when we believe we are moving forward. Breaking free is, therefore, an act of courage, a symbolic cutting of these threads that no longer serve us. This process can be painful because it requires renunciation. It involves looking at the past and admitting, this isn't me. It often involves letting go of labels that have defined us for decades. For example, the woman who has always been the good one needs to accept her anger as a legitimate part of herself. The man who has always been the rational one needs to embrace his sensitivity. These are internal archetypes that demand space, and denying this is to remain chained, shadow work becomes essential. Writing, reflecting, and confronting these narratives is like unlocking internal locks. Jung reminded us that only by facing what we fear can we achieve true freedom. In practice, this liberation manifests itself in bold choices. Someone who has been stuck in a suffocating job for years may decide to start something new, despite being judged. Another may end a relationship that seemed stable, but no longer nourished their soul. Still others decide to simply say no for the first time, breaking a pattern of submission. Spirituality calls this rebirth. Analytical psychology would call it a necessary rupture. Both describe the same act, refusing to live according to what limits us. Practical example, imagine someone who always believed they were not creative because they heard that as a child. At 40, they decide to take up painting or writing and discover a strength that has always been there, just stifled. This is the power of liberation. When the chains fall away, the self appears in its entirety. Life, which previously seemed narrow, suddenly gains new possibilities. The energy that was previously spent maintaining barriers begins to be directed toward creation, toward movement, toward life in its fullness. This liberation, however, does not mean the absence of limits, but rather the conscious choice of them. The difference is that now the person no longer accepts being bound by invisible bonds. It is a continuous process. With each step, new chains appear to be recognized and released. Jung would say that individuation is infinite. Each layer removed reveals another, deeper one. Spirituality echoes, freedom is not destiny, it is daily practice. And as this liberation movement takes hold, something powerful begins to emerge. It's not just the end of internal prisons, but the beginning of a life guided by wisdom, maturity, and renewed purpose. When old limitations are liberated, there's not just empty space left. A fertile field emerges for true wisdom to flourish. Carl Jung said that the self reveals itself more clearly when the ego is put in its proper place. And at 40, this balance begins to happen more naturally. Spirituality reinforces that maturity isn't synonymous with aging, but with seeing life from a different perspective, with depth, serenity, and a broader perception of the archetypes that inhabit us. It's the moment when we no longer seek having so much as being. Indeed, this wisdom doesn't come from books alone, but from the sum of all lived experiences, the victories, the mistakes, the stumbles, and even the shadows. Every pain faced becomes a brick of awareness. And here lies the great turning point. What was once a source of shame now becomes a learning experience. The person who always ran from their vulnerability begins to recognize it as strength. Those who always believed failures were the end of the line begin to see them as portals to growth. It is the mature perspective that integrates past and present, understanding that nothing was in vain. In practice, this maturity translates into more conscious choices. Instead of saying yes to everything, there's now room to say no without guilt. Instead of chasing external validation, the individual begins to seek internal alignment. This is where spirituality and psychology meet, living from the inside out. Reading works like Jung's memoirs, Dreams, Reflections, or even James Redfield's The Celestine Prophecy can further expand this perception, bringing both psychological clarity and spiritual insights into purpose. This wisdom also redefines priorities. What once seemed essential, status, quick achievements, the pursuit of approval, loses its luster. In its place, deeper questions emerge. How can I serve the world with who I am? What truly has value to me? What legacy do I want to leave? This shift is the result of individuation in action. It's no longer the ego dictating rules, but the self-guiding choices. And when this happens, a renewed purpose is born, one that doesn't depend on comparison or competition, but on authenticity. A practical example. Someone who spent their life working just for the paycheck might at 40 decide to use their experience to help others find meaning in their work. Or someone who has always remained silent for fear of judgment decides to share their vision of spirituality, discovering that their voice inspires. This is the power of maturity, transforming scars into compasses, transforming what once hurt into direction. Renewed purpose is not an abstract idea, but something experienced in everyday life. It means choosing aligned paths, even if simple. It means cultivating truer relationships. It means working not just for survival, but for contribution. It is maturity that gives the strength to sustain this movement. Spirituality would say it is the soul rediscovering its destiny. Jung would say it is the self emerging with clarity. And when this wisdom sets in, something even greater is announced, the invitation to begin again, not as someone who has wasted time, but as someone who has finally understood that life can be rebuilt from the inside out at any moment. When wisdom and maturity are consolidated, life offers a silent gift, an invitation to begin again. At 40, many people believe there's no more time, that the road has been set, and that changing would be too much of a risk. But Carl Jung showed otherwise. It is precisely at this point that the psyche is mature enough for true internal reconstruction. Spirituality reinforces this. Each ending is merely a disguise for a new beginning. The self, strengthened by shadow work and the integration of archetypes, begins to guide the steps toward a more authentic life. It's as if existence were whispering, "Now that you've found yourself, begin again," but this time with truth. This new beginning doesn't mean throwing everything away, but rather redefining it. It's like taking the pieces of life's puzzle and rearranging them in a way that truly makes sense. A person can keep the same job, but now with a different attitude. They can be in the same relationship, but now without masks. They can live in the same city, but with new eyes. Internal reconstruction isn't about changing the scenario, but about changing the actor who inhabits it. Spirituality calls this rebirth. Jung would call it full individuation. In practice, this invitation can manifest as an irresistible urge to start something new. Someone who always dreamed of studying art but never had the courage now finds the strength to take the first step. Another decides to undertake it, not to get rich, but to express their essence. There are those who seek to deepen their spirituality, exploring meditations, therapies, or inner journeys that previously seemed distant. This reconstruction is a daily choice. Each small gesture aligned with inner truth is a brick placed in that new house of the soul. Practical example. Think of someone who always believed they couldn't change careers after 40. By deciding to break this belief, they discover not only a new profession, but a new way of relating to life. Or someone who, after years in an inauthentic marriage, chooses to rebuild themselves alone, rediscovering strengths they didn't even know they had. This is the power of a new beginning, the chance to be born again within the same life. And here's the most inspiring detail. Inner reconstruction isn't an imposition, it's an invitation. Life doesn't force us, it merely offers signs. Recurring dreams, silent annoyances, old desires that resurface, all are calls to rebuild. The ego resists, of course, saying it's already too late. But the self insists, showing that it's never too early or too late to be who we are. This reconstruction, when accepted, transforms everything. The relationship with time changes. Instead of lamenting what has passed, the person focuses on what can still be created. The relationship with the future also changes. Instead of anxiety, hope emerges. I would say that spirituality is the soul choosing to flourish again. Jung would say it is the self finally accomplishing its work. And so, upon reaching 40, life makes it clear that it's not the end of anything, but the beginning of everything. because when awakening happens, every choice becomes an opportunity to begin again and to live, perhaps for the first time, fully and truly. At 40, you're not at the end of anything, you're at the beginning of everything. Carl Jung said that individuation intensifies at this stage because the ego can no longer sustain illusions on its own. Spirituality confirms this. It's when the soul refuses to live in silence that true awakening emerges. Weariness with masks isn't weakness. It's proof that you're ready to live authentically. So I ask you, how long will you sustain roles that aren't yours? How long will you hide behind external expectations, pretending that's enough? Do you have the courage to listen to the voice of the self, face the shadow, and rebuild yourself from the inside out? Because if you do, you'll discover that everything you've experienced so far has been just preparation. Life truly begins now. If this video resonated with you, share in the comments what resonated most with you. Sometimes putting it into words is the first step toward a new beginning. And don't forget to subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications, because this is just the beginning of your journey of awakening, spirituality, and transformation. The next step is up to you.